Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel. I'm so delighted you've joined me this evening. I love it when you guys tune in because I've got so many amazing stories to listen to and I don't want any of you to miss out on any of them. So make sure if you haven't subscribed that you do so. And to my subscribers, I send you heaps of love. Thanks for all your incredible encouragement. It makes doing this channel so worth my while. And I so enjoy sharing these incredible stories with you. So let's get started. Tonight's story comes from a man called Brian. I don't know whereabouts this happened because he doesn't give details in the letter of the location of this Bigfoot encounter as he was growing up in the 60s. But it's an encounter with an elderly Bigfoot, which is quite an unusual story to say the least. And it's really touching because it's actually quite sad, but very beautiful as well. So let's get started. Dear Sarah, I'm getting on in years now, and my name is Brian. My good looks have long since faded, as the ravages of time are clearly showing on my face, like the inevitable wrinkles and crow's feet around the eyes, not to mention my receding hairline, as well as a little paunch that I've been battling against for years, a very common phenomenon with men of my age. I also wear spectacles due to my poor eyesight, and I have a hearing aid as my hearing is not what it used to be. You could say I'm one of the fortunate ones because I do have normal blood pressure and great blood sugar levels, but I also have a touch of arthritis in my left hands, which does get me down from time to time. I have come to the stage of my life where I have started to accept the gravitational sagging effects that inevitably happen to us all as we age, when everything starts to head south. I have always professed that aging is indeed not for the faint-hearted, and I truly believe that. There is, however, one benefit, believe it or not, that comes with the aging process and experience, which is the liberating effects of not caring a stuff or a jot about what other people think or say about you. I cannot get my head around some of the social media stuff these days, when people can be so brutally unkind to each other and say the most hurtful and terrible things. In my generation, we would never be so insensitive towards other people's feelings. Today, they don't seem to care. We would never have dreamed of offending someone by being rude in my day. I truly think it's a tough, hard, brutal world out there, and I truly understand why so many people keep quiet about their experiences and encounters with the hairy man. Because if they speak out about such things, they may inevitably find themselves up against a barrage of abuse and ridicule, which really is extremely unfair. For many long years, I was also one of those people that kept my Bigfoot secret locked away in my heart with double bolts, because no matter what, I was never going to tell anyone my story. I believe there are tons of people like me out there. I was afraid of the mean things that people would say about me if I told them about my Bigfoot experience, because I just knew how cynical and dismissive people are. I also did not want to be the butt of everybody's jokes or regarded as a head case. It took me a lot of guts to write this letter, despite the fact that I don't care about people's opinions, because I truly believed that I would take my Bigfoot secret to the grave with me. And I never imagined in my wildest imaginations that there would be a day when I would share my encounter in an anonymous forum, which I truly appreciate because it feels good to share my story with all your listeners. My story started in the early 40s, when I was a mere 10 years old, and living in the woods in my parents' whitewashed family bungalow that was both spacious and big. We also had a couple of outbuildings on our property, but around our area were tons of lakes, gravel pits, ponds, streams, and beautiful valleys. You name it, we had everything. And there was an abundance of wildlife living around us, like deer, hog, turkeys, rabbits, squirrels, and the list goes on forever. And we also had our fair share of predators like mountain lions, cougars and bobcats. As a young boy growing up, I was more adventurous than most children of my age, and more daring and bold. I loved to explore the area where I lived, and I found so many ways to entertain myself. So I guess you could say that I was an extremely resourceful and imaginative young boy. Both my parents were extremely strict and very hard on me. I was not allowed to leave any food on my plate at dinner time, because if I did, I could forget about ever having any dessert, and dessert was always the best part of the meal. I also had to be in bed by 6 o'clock sharp, without any excuse, and I was never allowed to ever venture into the woods on my own, especially at night. My parents were very concerned about the hairy giant that they told me lived in the woods. They told me that this hairy giant ate little boys for dinner, but their attempts to scare me failed miserably, although I called their bluff by acting as if their words had terrified me. I think they felt truly satisfied and convinced by my good acting, because they believed that their good, well-behaved son was both sensible and responsible, and would keep out of the woods at all costs. My parents did not know that there was a whole nother side to my character that I kept very well hidden from them. They did not realize that their attempts to scare me had heightened and increased my fearless curiosity. I just knew that I wanted to get a good look at this hairy giant. Growing up, I had adored stories like Jack and the Beanstalk, so giants were of great interest to my childhood curiosity. One day I ventured into the woods all on my own when my parents were engaged in other jobs around the home. My father was fixing some of the kitchen cabinets, and my mother was busy catching up with some correspondence and writing letters to many of her friends who lived further afield, because my mother was Canadian. I remember the first day I got a glimpse of the hairy giant to be the most exciting and intriguing day of my entire life. Yet I do have to say that he was not what I was expecting to see. My childlike imagination had conjured up a different kind of a picture of what the hairy man or giant would look like. I searched the woods everywhere, looking for this hairy giant. I expected to see him towering over the treetops, with a long beard on his face and lots of hair all over his body. I saw no one, and felt so bitterly disappointed. Maybe my parents had lied about the hairy giant in the woods after all, and maybe he did not exist and it was all a mindless fabrication. Suddenly I heard a faint whistling sound coming from the edge of the woods, where there was a rocky embankment, and on the lower level of the rocky ledge was a large stream that ran through the whole area of our land. I saw a figure of a very large humanoid creature covered with short dark brown hair, paddling in the shallow area of the stream where the water was covering his ankles. His back was facing me, and I could see his very large shoulders and V-shaped upper torso, slender hips and long muscular legs. I also noticed he had long arms and human-like hands, but his left hand was missing 3 of the middle digits, maybe due to some accident, because there were still little stumps on his hand where his fingers had once been. I wondered if this was the hairy giant my parents had been talking about, but I didn't think a giant was this short. Granted, he was much taller than an average man. I would say he was 7 foot tall and 500 pounds, but that was not nearly as big as I'd expected him to be and hoped that he would be. I hid behind the rocky outcrop that overlooked the stream and watched the creature curiously. I got the impression that he was elderly, much like my grandfather. Even though he was agile and strong, there was something about his very slow movements that made me see him as somewhat advanced in years. He appeared to have a small animal pelt in his hands and was using it much like a bowl to hold the little creatures that he was catching from the water inside. I was too far away to see what those creatures were, but I imagined they were small little fish. The hairy giant whistled happily to himself and was so absorbed in what he was doing, and his demeanour gave me the impression that he was really quite a mellow character. I did not believe my parents' story about him eating little boys for breakfast because the creature seemed harmless to me, and I was never afraid of him, despite the fact that I always hid from him, so he never once physically got to see me. Once he had finished gathering his food, he started to eat it as he squatted on the rocky ledge, almost as if he was eating a bag of popcorn. Well, that's what it looked like to me. Over the next couple of years, I would regularly spy on the hairy giant. I do not think he knew I was there. His advanced years did mean that he sometimes appeared a little confused and absent-minded. And when I looked at his hair, I did notice lots of grey hair forming, so I imagine that was also a sign of aging. As a young boy, looking for fun and adventure, I just loved to prank the hairy fellow. I knew exactly where his nest was and where he would go and sleep, so when he was not around, I loved to play all kinds of tricks on him. One of my favourite things to do was to steal one of the small animal carcasses in his nest that he was always planning to eat later on in the day. He never killed anything big because I just don't think he had much of a big appetite. Much like elderly people today, they tend to reduce their hunger as they get older. I know that I have. He went after small things like squirrels and rabbits and slugs and frogs and insects, as well as bulbs and a grass of some kind. So I would hide the dead creature in another place close to his nest. I loved to see how confused the hairy giant would become when he could not find his food in his nest. He would scratch his head, looking bewildered, and he would look around for his meal, looking completely confused. When he found the dinner later in a strange place, he would look so thrilled about the find, almost like the excitement we get as children when we open a Christmas present. That was how much he reacted and would chatter happily to himself when he found and retrieved the dead squirrel. I just loved watching his reactions, and this old creature just made me laugh. The giant hairy man had a special tree that he loved scratching his body against, and when he did this, he would moan with sheer pleasure because I think he got very, very itchy. He had rubbed a lot of the natural bark off this tree because of his excessive scratching. I used to call that his scratching post. So there was a natural long area of smooth, lighter wood exposed. One day I coated the whole scratching area with peanut butter so that his coat would get covered with the stuff, and I thought it would be funny to watch him covered with all the muck. But my prank failed miserably because he smelt the peanut butter instantly, and on his knees he licked that whole scratching area clean with his tongue. But it was really funny to watch because he licked that trunk clean like a popsicle, and he seemed utterly delighted. Another time I filled balloons with water and hid them under the bedding material when he sat down on his nest that was layered with lots of moss and soft grasses. When he sat down on the balloons, they popped under his weight and he got completely covered with water. It was all I could do to contain my laughter. Once again, he would look surprised and very confused and wondering where that water had come from. He had a stunned expression on his primate-like face, which was just hilarious to watch. I would have lost interest in pranking him if it was not so funny to watch his reactions. Even today, I have yet to see anyone that can compete with this comical creature and the way he facially reacted to all my little pranks. I think the creature did not have a family, which was really sad and made me warm to him a lot, because I could identify with his loneliness. And he lived all on his own in those forests, but in winter he would change the location of his nest and he would sleep in this little run-down old hunter's cabin that was in the woods, that was very derelict, and that was where he would make his new nest. I did feel sorry for the old fellow, and during the winter I would sometimes put apples in his nest and peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which he grew to love. I think he just thought they rained from heaven. He would look so excited and surprised to find the treats, although I do not believe he ever knew that they came from me. One day I noticed that the hairy giant was sleeping all the time and barely got up during the day. It was like he was always tired. I would creep up to the old fellow, and I would get really close, and he would never notice me. Sometimes I heard him moaning as if he was in pain. In those times I brought him some food from my home quite regularly, but sometimes I noticed he never touched it. One morning I discovered that the hairy giant had died overnight. His body was completely limp, and I was devastated. I remember lying there in the woods for a very long time, very close to his body. I even stroked his dead fur. And I just cried and cried and cried. I think I even howled, I'm not ashamed to admit. I do know that my parents wondered why I had become so withdrawn and so down in the dumps and so grumpy for a long time. I think in truth, being a young boy without siblings, I did get exceedingly lonely, and the hairy giant was a great source of entertainment for me. And although he never saw me, I always regarded him as my best friend. Even now, remembering all this is choking me up and making me cry, because it makes me desperately sad remembering this fellow with such incredible fondness. I could not tell my parents about the hairy giant, because then I would have got into heaps of trouble for being so disobedient, and I did not want to get into trouble and face my father's wrath, because sometimes he would belt me on the bottom, and I didn't want any of that. Bear in mind, I was a child at the time, but I was determined to give the creature a decent burial. So I would spend the following weeks digging the old fellow's grave, because he was so big and I was so young and not very strong, so it took me a long time to dig that grave. And while his body is exposed, it did get to stink, and of course parts of it were ravaged by wild animals, but I still managed to bury those bones. And I remember taking flowers from our own garden and placing them on his grave, and I even said all kinds of prayers over the creature. So I really gave him the send-off that he deserved. Now I'm getting on in age, and I've slowed down considerably, just like the hairy giant did. So I really identify with that time of his life, because I'm experiencing what he experienced now. I have moments when I'm also forgetful and lose things all the time and wonder where I put them. And my body is also not as cooperative as it used to be. I know exactly how the old fellow must have felt. Also, I'm completely on my own as he was in those woods. You see, my wife died 2 years ago, and my parents are long since deceased. So I am identifying with that creature more and more every single day. Please do not feel sorry for me, because like the hairy giant, I potter around my life, and many of the small things in life give me the greatest pleasure, like the bird song and the beautiful sunsets. So yes, there is still a lot to live for and to enjoy. It was 20 years ago when I discovered the creature I encountered was a Bigfoot. I learnt that from the incredible media that we have available today. I can promise you that there are tons of people out there that are sitting in Bigfoot secrets just like me, because they are too terrified to share them. But I would like to use this opportunity to encourage them to come forward in an anonymous forum like this, because it really is healing and cathartic to get all those feelings and emotions out onto paper, and hopefully share them with an appreciative and believing audience. If there is life after death, which I indeed believe there is, And if there is a heaven, like many believe, one of the people I would like to meet most in the afterlife is the hairy giant. He holds a huge and very special place in my heart and has done so from the moment I saw him. And for all you cynics out there, I promise you that these creatures exist in the forests of North America. And just because you may never get to see one does not mean that they are not real. So do not judge anyone too hardly who says that they've had an encounter with the hairy man. Do you know, I am so tearful and choked up listening to that story. I just feel for that hairy man, and I also feel for the writer of the story. I just feel so emotional. It's just so sad. But I'm just so glad that he had such a wonderful send-off. I'm sorry about that. I'm just getting so emotional. Anyway, I do hope you enjoyed the story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.